So today, primarily, of course, I'll be getting into, like I said, the Middle Ages. That's going to be our big topic, of course, this week. Like I said, that will be on our final exam. I'll talk primarily about the Byzantine Empire. I'm going to go into that a little bit, at least the early history of the Byzantine Empire. And then I'll get into and discuss the rise of Islam, like Muhammad, develops Islam, of course, Arabian Peninsula, how it spreads, of course, from there. I'll also talk about the rise of the Franks, who take over most of Western Europe, like France, Germany, part of Italy as well. So we'll get into them also as well. So if you want to join me, and of course, in StreamYard.com, there, of course, is the link right here, of course, below. So anyway, yeah, you can see the Hagia Sophia behind me. I don't know if you see that or not. That's, of course, a very famous cathedral that was built, of course, by the Byzantine Empire, I think under Emperor Justinian the Great, who I'll talk about today. It's kind of controversial today, you know, because they originally was an Eastern Orthodox church. Of course, it was for a museum for a long time, and now I think if you know about Republic of Turkey, they've converted it to a mosque again, which is kind of a controversy, I know, today. But anyway, so yeah, let me get in, of course, we'll talk about the Byzantine Empire. I'll kind of get into the early history of the Byzantine, which we can see the dates of the Eastern Roman Empire, which is the common name that they usually call it. But I'll kind of explain later, like why they nickname it the Byzantine or Byzantine. I think it's pronounced different ways, with the name. The Byzantine Empire was like a continuation of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, it collapsed in the West, that kind of deal, but it continued in the East. In fact, for a while, of course, we'll get to it a little bit later, they did actually reconquer some of the West. They got it back, and they lost it again. But this particular form of the Roman Empire was a smaller version. It was more Hellenized, like more of a Greek version, more than anything, because most people spoke Greek instead of Latin. It included most of its eastern provinces were kind of included in it. I'll kind of explain. Of course, it was around a long time. That's something a lot of people don't understand about this particular empire. It was around for over 1,000 years, at least smaller versions of it were around. 1,123 years. I guess if you go back to the founding of Constantinople in the year 330, and it was conquered by the Ottoman Empire, the Turks, in 1453. That's when Constantinople fell to them. And as you know, later it was called Istanbul, which is the modern name, of course, they call it today. I'll explain why it's called that a little bit later about that also as well. The term Byzantine or Byzantine, it's I guess pronounced different ways, came from the fact that a long time ago there was an ancient Greek city there that was on the Black Sea or near the Black Sea that was called Byzantium or Byzantium, it's either pronounced either way. And Constantine supposedly, came in the year around before 330 and basically began building the city there right on that top of that city. And so that's where the later term was used, Byzantine or Byzantine Empire, which is more of a modern nickname, they called it. People back then didn't really call it that. They didn't go around and say, oh, we're the Byzantines or whatever. They didn't really call themselves that. I think they called themselves more like Romans themselves. And the term Romania, I think maybe they say, may have been a term that they sometimes used to call their state, which is where the origin of the modern nation's name now today, that's kind of in that same area, Romania, which is kind of west of the Black Sea now. One thing about the Byzantine Empire, of course, I'll kind of show you this picture here. It's famous for its double-headed eagle, which you can see there, which the eagle represented supposedly the fact that this empire was controlled part of the East and the West. Like some was facing west, like towards Europe, and some was also facing east, towards Asia. So that's kind of a popular type of, symbol that's used by a lot of different states, like in Europe. I think Russia used it, the Germans used it, etc. I think the Austro-Hungarian Empire also used it too in Europe. And one thing that's famous about the Byzantine Empire, it is one of the first major Christian states to form. So it was. Of course, most of its main religion was based off of Eastern Orthodox Christianity. That's why that's a big deal where the Hagia Sophia, it's been converted to a mosque, because a lot of Christians, like Orthodox Christians anyway, see it as where the holy seat of where that religion started a long time ago, especially in Russia. I know it's a big thing. And it was also where the Patriarch of Constantinople, kind of ran the church from. He was their religious leader. And so that is one thing that's kind of unique. And, Constantine the Great, built Constantinople as to be a Christian type city, more or less. They had other religions like Judaism and so on. I guess they were kind of minority religions and so on, but pretty much it was seen as a Christian state. Hey, Devin, what's going on? Nash is asking me about the exempt list. I'll do that later, of course, probably in week 7, week 8, probably about the weekend. I'll have a list later on Canvas. But anyway, I'll get to it later, but we'll get more into the peak of the empire itself, which is in the 6th century. What areas did they control? If you show this map here, can kind of show you the size of the actual empire. The area, that orange area, you can see on the right-hand side, that's the area where most of the Byzantine Empire was. So Greece, Turkey, Syria, Israel, Lebanon, part of Egypt, and part of North Africa where Libya is, I guess, was also controlled by them as well. Later in the 6th century, you can see they added territories in North Africa, southern Spain, also around Italy as well. So they at one point they did get it back, but they lost it after the 6th century. So that was the peak of it. But over time, the empire shrank due to Muslim invasions by the Arabs and later the Turks as well. The Crusades kind of helped to also cause its decline as well. And then the Ottoman Empire, the Turks later, conquered it, like I said, in 1453, when Constantinople was sacked by them and, taken. And today it's called Istanbul. I don't know if you know that or not, but that's the more modern name. They call it now, which is not the capital of the Republic of Turkey. That's Ankara. You know about that. But it's, of course, the largest city, really, in Turkey now. That became one of their major cities, by the way, after the Ottoman Empire collapsed after World War I, because they were on the losing side of the Germans in World War I and all that. Why do they call it Istanbul, by the way? It's called that because a long time ago, this used to be an old Greek saying about Constantinople, which is, let's go to the city. And so supposedly Istanbul is a Turkish saying that means to the city from that. And so that's what it means. And so that's kind of where the name came from, supposedly. Hey, Morrison. Good morning. Hope you're having a great time out there. Let me get into and talk about, of course, a little bit more about the early Byzantine Empire. There was, of course, a famous emperor who came to power in the 6th century. He was part of a dynasty which was called the Justinian dynasty, which was, I think, went from the 6th to the 7th centuries that you had. He was, by the way, the peak ruler, probably the greatest ruler, really, of the Byzantine Empire, which I've got a picture of Justinian right here. He ruled from 527 to 565. He was, by the way, one of their longest reigning rulers that they had. And he had a nickname. He was called, by the way, which was, they often called him the last Roman, was one of his names, his nicknames, the last Roman. They called him that because of the fact that he was one of the last major, emperors to control the West, like Rome and all that. And then also he was one of the last emperors that actually knew Latin, could speak Latin at one point, because most of them later, of course, speak Greek. Greek's pretty much the main language that the Byzantine Empire rules under later. And so that's why Justinian's kind of important with him. The reason why we know a lot about Justinian, there was actually this historian that wrote a lot about him. I could try to find him right here, which is Procopius of Caesarea. He wrote a lot of history about Justinian's reign. In fact, he wrote 3 books on Justinian's empire at the time, which was the Wars of Justinian, the buildings, it's often called, or the buildings of Justinian, which talks about all the different building projects that he was kind of known for, Justinian. Also, The Secret History was something he wrote, Procopius, which is kind of famous. It's a book that was later found in the Vatican Library, believe it or not. And it told kind of like the true story about Justinian. Apparently, Justinian was not exactly he was a great ruler, but he was very ruthless, very cruel, kind of like ruled as almost like a dictator, which a lot of the Byzantine emperors were more absolute, for sure, compared to some of the emperors, like, say, in the West, which were kind of like figureheads. And so that's one thing he was kind of known for. And he also, Justinian was also known for his wife, Theodora, Empress Theodora, who some say was the real power behind the throne. She was apparently this ex-circus performer who may have been a prostitute or something like that, who he married. And she was the one, like I said, that had the real pants, I guess, more than anything, that basically controlled the empire, etc. Hey, Daphne, what's going on? Hope you're having a great morning also as well. Let me talk a little bit about, of course, more about Constantinople. So we've kind of talked about that, right? I need to first talk about, I guess, some of the things that Justinian's kind of known for. Well, yeah, he was one of the first emperors to, like I said, reconquer the West. That's something that he is kind of known for under him. And so he did reconquer it, basically. And there was a general under him named Belisarius that Procopius talks a lot about. Here he is, picture him right here. And he was involved in a conquest which took something like 2 or 3 decades for the Romans to reconquer the western part of the Roman Empire, which had fallen to different barbarian groups, like Germanic barbarian groups in the West. Starting in the 530s CE, if you go to this map here, one of the first areas that they took back was the area of Carthage, which you can see here. Carthage was controlled by the Vandalic kingdom. And so Belisarius' forces came by sea, invaded Carthage, and retook it within so many years. And Justinian's forces actually destroyed it. They destroyed the Vandalic kingdom, wiped it out. And then from there, they attacked into the southern part of Spain and was able to re-seize that area around where Cordoba is. They took that back also as well, including a lot of the islands in the Mediterranean. You can see Balearic Islands. They took back Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, were all re-seized. Then against the Ostrogoths, they retook most of Italy, but that took the longest in probably the bloodiest of the wars. It's part of why Rome ends up getting partially destroyed, like why it's in such ruins later, because of all these wars and trying to retake that territory. Sad thing was, after Justinian died later, they lost most of the territory they conquered. So within so many years, they got it back, the barbarians in the West. And so it was just kind of more or less all for nothing in the end. Other things that Justinian's kind of famous for, of course, I mentioned already, he built the Hagia Sophia. That was something he did during his reign, like I said. That was, of course, the famous cathedral or church, which became the center of, by the way, the religion, the Orthodox faith, the Byzantine Empire today. So he built that. Hagia Sophia, by the way, means the Church of Holy Wisdom. That's what it means in Greek. It was like one of several churches that were built. There's one that Hagia Irene, I think, is another one that they constructed as well. I think the Blue Mosque was another one that was a church before that too as well, which is also at Istanbul. And anyway, so yeah, he was known for those like construction projects like that as well. And then the other thing that Justinian was very famous for was the Justinian Code, which you may have heard about as well. Yeah, the Justinian Code. That's probably his most famous thing that he's well known for today. These were a series of legal reforms that were done in the Byzantine Empire sometime around the 530s CE was when it was taken up. And the Justinian Code was originally called the Corpus Juris Civilis, which meant in Latin, body of civil law. And what they did was they went back and they codified all of the Roman laws that went back to the period of the 5 good emperors. I want to say back to maybe the time of Emperor Hadrian or something like that. That's how far it went back, some of the law codes. They compiled them over like, I guess, three, 4 centuries right there. And so it became like one big law code. And the code itself influenced a lot of other codes, like, by your Western law and its traditions are heavily influenced by the Justinian Code. The Napoleonic Code, if you know about it, was pretty much influenced by the Justinian Code later. It also had 4 sections. I don't know if you have to know about the other sections they had. The main code, the Codex, had something like almost 5,000 laws in it, which is a lot of laws. Of course, that was part of it. They also had like the Digest, which was a series of commentary in legal opinions by various lawyers in Roman history that went back many years. I think that was something like 50 volumes in that too, as well. The Institutes was like kind of like this textbook on how to teach students how to read the law codes, like how to do it and all that. Then the Novella was like a series of new laws that were created after the Justinian Code was created. It's where I suppose where the word novel comes from, like a novel, the word, for like a book, fiction book, of course, today. But yeah, that's one of the things he's kind of known for, Justinian, so-called Justinian Code, which I guess is his legacy now, if you think about it today overall. There were other things that happened on Justinian that were kind of bad. They had the so-called plague of Justinian that broke out during his reign that Procopius also commented about too in some of his books. And it was a massive outbreak of bubonic plague that killed, they think, several million people within the Byzantine Empire. They think it was a major cause of why their empire declined, not just because of, like, say, the Muslim invasions and things like that that were out there that caused its decline, but basically, yeah, it was one of those things that really, led to it later. Let me also talk about as well, get into and just kind of mention some of the other things about the Byzantine Empire, at least the Constantinople. I'll kind of go into just talk about a few things about it that's kind of famous as well. Here's kind of a map of the actual city itself. Those are kind of some landmarks that are kind of important in the Byzantine Empire. That Great Palace, I don't know if you see that or not, but that's right in the middle on the bottom here. That was the main palace of the Byzantine emperors that they ruled from, which I think they ruled from like 800 years at one point. It was started by Constantine. Justinian added on to it, and other emperors added on to it later as well. So it's like one of their main palaces. It was also called the Sacred Palace as well. Most of it doesn't exist anymore. I think it's under the old city of Constantinople. Next to it is the Hippodrome. Hippodrome was the famous, or called the Hippodrome of Constantinople, was the famous racetrack where the Byzantines would basically put on like chariot racing, horse racing, and other kinds of forms of entertainment. It's pretty large in size. It was about 1,500 feet long, this actual racetrack. And now it doesn't exist anymore. I think there's some kind of square there now in Istanbul, but apparently that was a big thing in the Greek world, Greek-Roman world, of course, which was chariot racing, horse racing, which I'm sure a lot of gambling was also associated with as well. Hagia Sophia, of course, located right here. I just mentioned, of course, just several churches that are kind of around that same area. They were built kind of to the north of the Great Palace as well. I've got a picture showing also the peninsula itself. One thing about Constantinople, it was built on a peninsula, which you can see here in this map, and was heavily fortified also as well. And so they built a lot of fortifications with the actual city. They were real famous. And there's actually this road that kind of ran westward, like from where like all the main buildings were, called the Mizu, which meant middle way or middle street. It was called. And they had a series of fortified walls that were built by multiple emperors. The most famous, of course, the Theodosian walls, probably the most famous that were constructed at Constantinople. And then they also had the Constantinian walls that were built too by Constantine the Great. So it's kind of like a double line of defense that they had. The Theodosian walls, of course, were built famously by Theodosius II, of course, a grandson of Theodosius the Great. It was built primarily to keep out barbarians like the Huns and other barbarians from attacking from the west. And so it's part of why Constantinople for many years was not taken, because it was heavily fortified capital. Also, they had a great naval power. That's another thing, too. The Byzantine Empire had a great naval power like the Romans did, which played a major role in the defense of the city and their empire. And they had this weapon they had that was very famous with their ships that they used, which was called Greek fire. And Greek fire was a type of incendiary weapon that was like a flamethrower, where they would shoot flames at like ships, like napalm. It would burst their ships into fire. And I think they say that the Byzantine Empire developed in the 7th century, and they used it for many years against enemies and stuff like that. So things like that kind of, helped to, keep them in power a long time, because they had a pretty good military. Whereas in the West, the Western Empire, their military was not as good. It was controlled mostly by Germans, who eventually took over the empire anyway. And so they didn't rely as much on mercenaries like they did in the West. Constantinople was also very wealthy for a long time. Throughout the Middle Ages, like most of the Asian trade went through the Black Sea, and their port was very wealthy. They were so wealthy that the port of Constantinople, that they call it the Golden Horn, was one of the nicknames that they often called it. So the Byzantine Empire, like I said, stood for a long time, but over time in the Middle Ages, it would eventually decline, mostly due to the rise of Islam, which I'll, of course, get into also today. So I'll come back and maybe talk about some of these other things later about that period. But when we're going to, of course, move on to talk about I want to get into the rise of Islam a little today as well, which also happened in the Middle Ages. You got that particular event occurring, and which happened mostly in the Arabian Peninsula, where majority of that, especially the western part, is Saudi Arabia. Of course, you've got Islam, forms there, which, Islam is one of the 3 Abrahamic religions, right? We've already talked about Judaism and the rise of Christianity. Well, in the 7th century, you got Islam, of course, that was founded by the Arab prophet Muhammad. A lot of Muslims, they think he was one of the last great prophets that they had, that went back to the time of Moses and all that. And originally Muhammad was actually a merchant. He was from Mecca, anyway, he began to have these visions. If you know about this, where he was visited by the angel Gabriel, and he was told that he was the last great prophet, and he was told to basically convert everybody to Islam, because most Arabs, about that in the Middle East, like especially in that area around the Arabian Peninsula, were pagans. They were worshiping all these different, polytheistic gods. I think they call them jinn spirits or something like that, that lived in nature in general. And so eventually he's going to spread it like throughout Saudi Arabia, Muhammad. And then from there, it'll spread through like into 3 continents. It'll go into it'll go into Africa, also go into like Southwestern Asia. It'll even go into parts of Europe at one point. And so Islam later will grow into like the second, largest religion in the world. I think it's Christianity first, followed by Islam, and then Hinduism, I think, is the third largest religion in the world. And by the way, the name Islam, by the way, means submission to God or submissive ones. I think it can also mean, or surrendering to God. So I think another translation. Then Muslim means submissive ones, is what originally meant. At first, by the way, you see here, after he got these revelations and began to develop the religion of Islam, a lot of people didn't believe it. If you know about this, they refused to join his religion, and they forced him out of Mecca. He was forced to flee the flight of Muhammad, a hijra of Muhammad. He fled from Mecca to Medina, and it's at Medina where Muhammad eventually develops Islam. This, of course, will happen. And then he's going to come back later. He'll retake Mecca, and then all of Saudi Arabia, that area around the Arabian Peninsula, will become eventually, like I say, Muslim. And then from there, it's going to spread to North Africa, spreads into Israel, Syria. Then it goes into like all the way into like Iraq, Iran, Persia, later into India. You know about that. Then also into Spain, in southern Spain at one point as well. These, of course, are still today, the holiest cities in Islam. You have the cities of Mecca, Medina. Medina is the city of the Prophet, of course. We have the Prophet's Mosque, as you know. Mecca is where they got the Great Mosque, where the Kaaba is. You know about that today. But Mecca, like I said, is the holiest city, of course, Islam today still. Following Muhammad's death, Muhammad died in 632 CE or AD. They compiled the Quran, which a lot of this was became the sacred or religious text Islam. And it means reciting. It was supposedly in Arabic because supposedly it was recited to Muhammad through, I guess, Gabriel orally. And then over time it was written down, originally in Arabic. And of course, now it's been translated into multiple languages in the world. Later, they divided into different verses or chapters called a surah. And so basically the Quran, I think it was kind of written down, I want to say close to about the mid 7th century is about when it is. But they also have the hadith and other teachings of Muhammad that have also been passed down, which were also important as well. From the Quran and Muhammad's teachings, you also get the 5 pillars of Islam, which they developed later, which most, I guess, conservative Islam Muslims must have to follow. And so you got, what they call the first pillar of Islam, of course, which is faith, shahada, which is the idea of, faith, that you believe in Muhammad, in that, and also in Allah. That Muhammad is the only prophet, and of course Allah is God. 2 is prayer, the belief in having prayer every day, at least 5 times a day, prayer. Salat, almsgiving, it means to give to the poor and things like that. Charity, zakat, fasting, psalm especially during Ramadan, also as well. And then the pilgrimage, that was another thing. The Hajj became also another thing that was a big thing with the pillars of Islam as well, which is the belief that a Muslim should make a journey to Mecca, Medina, where Muhammad lived, and all that, of course, in the Middle East. So I think most should, most, devout Muslims do that, I guess, or try to do that, unless you're sick or something or too poor, that kind of thing. Famous mosque in, of course, Islam. I told you about some of these already. The Prophet's Mosque was supposedly the first mosque built, of course, which was built in Medina originally. The Great Mosque of Mecca, of course, was the other one, which has the Kaaba in it, of course, as well. Al-Aqsa Mosque is pretty big too. It's in Jerusalem, built later on the Temple Mount, where the old Jerusalem temple was a long time ago. Then the Dome of the Rock was a shrine later built, they believe, I want to say around the 8th century. That was a type of Islamic shrine that was built to honor Muhammad. Supposedly it honors the site where Muhammad descended to heaven, right there. Well, it's been debated about whether Muhammad actually died in Jerusalem. I think he died actually, they think, in Saudi Arabia, but there's a Islamic belief that that's what happened later. But the Dome of the Rock is kind of controversial because the Jews think that was the site of where, you know the story about this, where Abraham supposedly was going to sacrifice Isaac or something. I think that's what they say anyway. Or it may have been where or another theory I've heard is that also that's where the Ark of the Covenant was kept or something like that. And that's why it's kind of controversial with the Jews versus the Arabs and all that. Now, kind of some more slides here. Now, after Muhammad died, you can see Islam spread throughout the world. You can see here's kind of the areas that it kind of went into. From Saudi Arabia, like we're in the Arabian Peninsula, as you can see, conquered most of that in that dark green area. Then you can see they pushed westward into Egypt, Libya, then into southwestern Asia, Israel, Syria, Persia, Iraq and Iran, North Africa, and then, of course, into Spain. Those are the bulk of the areas that they kind of conquer early on, up to the early Middle Ages, you can see. Later, the Ottoman Empire pushed it further into parts of like Turkey, also into parts of like where Greece is in Eastern Europe, like the Turks do later. So it does get into parts of Eastern Europe you're looking at right there. Now, the only thing is, though, after Muhammad died, they had these caliphs that came in, so-called successors to Muhammad. They took over, and there were actually these political religious leaders that most of them were not related to Muhammad, but they took over and pretty much led the religion and kind of spread the religion all over the world, you can see. And there were only 4 of them that were kind of the early ones that were kind of famous. They had Abu Bakr, who was his father-in-law Muhammad, like he had married one of his daughters. Omar, who was like an advisor to Muhammad, was also another caliph who was very famous. He was also a pretty good general. Omar was one of the greatest conquerors in Islam. He conquered more territory than any other Islamic conqueror or general. Uthman was a son-in-law of Muhammad, who was also one of his best friends as well. And then Ali was a cousin who also ruled. They kind of ruled one after the other, 1 through 4 there. All of them were murdered or assassinated at one point, which was kind of a conflict in early Islam. And one of the things that happened that's kind of famous, the Ali, after he was killed, like assassinated, it actually split Islam in half, like in the 2 religious sects. If you know about this, the Sunni, Muslims, and you have those that are the Shia or Shiite Muslims as well, which are more of a minority. I think I want to say the Sunni make up like 80-85% of Muslims, and then 10-15% or so are a minority of the Shiite, which I think the Shia type Muslims are mostly based around like where Syria, Iraq is, kind of around there somewhere. That's where they mostly are. And part of the conflict, if you know about this, was the Shiite Muslims believed that the successor to Muhammad should be somehow related to Muhammad, like a descendant, and not anybody that's not. That became a major conflict between the 2. Sunni, of course, disagree with this. They think it could be anybody, I guess, who's a good leader, who can lead Islam or whatever. And so that was a big difference between the 2 that kind of helped split them apart originally. Over time, they had these caliphate dynasties that also came in later. There's 2 of them. There's one called the Umayyad dynasty that was first, who reigned in the 7th, 8th centuries. which was based at Damascus, which was in Syria. They were related back to one of Uthman's relatives that we talked about, which I think was the third caliph. And it was like a general under him that kind of came to power. And he started the dynasty. He, of course, was not related to Muhammad, which was kind of a conflict. And, of course, the Shia didn't like this and broke away from them and all that. And later he had another dynasty called the Abbasid dynasty, caliphate as well. This one was related back to Muhammad through like a distant uncle named Abu al-Abbas. You see there, As-Safa. And they would later rule from Baghdad in Iraq. So you can see here that Islam kind of like, for a while, it was centered like first in Syria, like in the early Middle Ages, like right here. Then it shifted eastward towards Baghdad more over time. So yeah, obviously different centers of Islam, that you had in the early Middle Ages, etc. Some people think that actually this other guy, you ever heard of Al-Mansur? He's the founder of Baghdad, who may have been the brother of Abu al-Abbas, As-Safa, but they think he was the actual real founder of the Caliphate dynasty of the Abbasids. That's what some people think anyway. He's also the founder of Baghdad, the city, like the capital of Iraq today that you have as well. But the Abbasids was like the golden age of Islam for a while in the Middle Ages, but later what happened was the Mongols came in. They sacked Iraq and other parts of like Persia. And so that caused a lot of that to go down. And what happened afterwards was the Turks came in, and the Turks took over after that. The Turks kind of merged the Mongols and all that later, if you know about that, and became Muslim. And the Turkish peoples who were from like Caucasian peoples from Central Asia entered Persia and Turkey and all that, took it over, and they converted over to Sunni Islam. And so they would form their own empires later because of this. And so you get empires like the Great Seljuk Empire, the Seljuk Turks. You may have heard of them. We'll talk about them later. The Seljuk Turks were the first to come in to the Middle East in rule. They helped form that at first. The Timurid Empire, which kind of broke away from that later as well, which ruled Persia as well. That was another empire that formed after the Mongols came in. Ottoman Empire was, of course, one of the most famous empires, probably the longest empire that was around for almost 6-7 centuries. It ruled most of the Mediterranean Sea in the east, most of Persia, Saudi Arabia, and all that. And then they have the Mughal Empire as well in Persia and India. So you have that too, all these different Islamic empires, of course, that formed later. A lot of them were in modern times too, like the last two that you're looking at there. But the Turks are a big cause of why the Byzantine Empire would decline. I'll get to it later, but it spawns the Crusades in Europe with the Middle East. And I'll get to that probably tomorrow, discuss that. But those two end up fighting it out. A lot of it was because of the fact that the Turks took over Turkey, which they get their name from, and so that they think the fall of Turkey was one of the major causes of why the Byzantine Empire would start declining and fold. So anyway, kind of talking about the rise of Islam today, kind of how it develops over time. Here are some pictures, by the way, showing some of the mosques, of course. By the way, that is the so-called, they call it the Great Mosque of Mecca you're looking at right here. And the Kaaba supposedly holds this meteorite that is very sacred. It's like one of the last, I think, symbols of the old pagan days. They used to put a lot of these pagan idols in it or whatever. And it was supposedly kept, from a long time ago. Supposedly the Kaaba was built by Abraham or something, or Ibrahim as they call it, the Arabs, of course, a long time ago. Here's the other one, of course, I mentioned the Dome of the Rock, which has its famous gold dome to it. Later, the Templars later used it as their headquarters, by the way, when they took over Jerusalem, which is, of course, true about that. All right, let me go ahead and move on today. I want to go ahead and we're going to also talk about the early Middle Ages. So I want to, of course, get into that today and discuss, the background of the Middle Ages today. Of course, we'll get into talk about, the rise of the Franks. That's one of the big things that's kind of a major people that really take over Western Europe in the early Middle Ages. Well, we haven't really got into the Middle Ages itself, like the name and all that and where it came from. But the Middle Ages really starts, I think, with the collapse of the Roman Empire. It's really something more in Europe, like medieval Europe. And usually it starts around the 5th century, although historians do think that the Middle Ages goes back further, probably back to maybe the 3rd century when the Roman Empire started declining in Europe. But the peak of the Middle Ages is usually about 500 to 1500, usually in those dates that you're looking at right there. It's kind of rounded off, today. And the term Middle Ages is a term that evolved more into the late Middle Ages or modern times. In fact, the term medieval is more of a term they started using in the late Middle Ages. In fact, the word medieval means middle age, from the Latin term, which is medium evum, and so it became this nickname, for the Middle Ages, which they started using like during the Renaissance, the name, and so the name stuck basically. But they call it Middle Age because the fact that it was this middle period that was between like the fall of the Roman Empire in the modern times and the Renaissance began, like in Italy. So that's why it's called Middle Age. It was a between period between the fall of the Roman Empire, of course, in modern times. They believe the term Dark Ages, it became popular too, especially by the Renaissance. There was a writer named Petrarch, who was an Italian writer. They think he's the father of the Renaissance. About this. They say he's the one who coined the term Dark Age, being used when cultures and civilizations decline, like in history. And so that term has been often used a lot to describe different civilizations that have done this before. Remember, like the Greek Dark Age and all that we had before. And so, yeah, they had this period where in Europe, there's a decline in culture, etc., due to the decline of the Roman Empire. So most of the Dark Age they talk about is predominantly the early Middle Ages. That was the worst period of it. In high to late Middle Ages, it's not as bad, but obviously it wasn't as advanced before, like say, under the Roman period. By the way, historians later break up the Middle Ages into 3 sub-periods. These are kind of about the dates of when they usually put them at. 500 to about 1000 is usually what they call the early Middle Ages. High Middle Ages, sometimes called the Central Middle Ages, called different names. 1000 to maybe 1300. Then late Middle Ages is 1300 to about the 1500s. So I'll get into it later, but the early Middle Ages is when you got the rise of the Franks, the Vikings coming in, invasions in Europe still going on. High Middle Ages, you got like the Crusades going on, as an example. Probably the most famous thing happened in High Middle Ages. Rise of France, rise of England, rise of Germany and the Holy Roman Empire. Late Middle Ages, you got the Renaissance, that you got the most famous event happened during that time as well. Exactly what was medieval culture like in Europe? Well, it was a mix of different cultures, mostly Germanic, but there's other like cultures that were non-Germanic too, like different Muslim cultures that were brought like into Spain. You don't forget about that. They had, because of the Umayyads that came in and conquered it and all that. A lot of different Asiatic peoples migrated, like the Magyar. Don't forget about the Magyars. The Magyars, the Hungarian peoples, migrated into Europe as an example, which helped develop Hungary later. But the Magyars were descended supposedly back to the Huns and all that. They think as well. So you got them going on as well. Of course, I'll get to the Franks come into like France and Germany, rule that area, and then the Vikings also come in and kind of influence it as well. But obviously, the Roman Catholic faith is a big major thing that really influences medieval Europe. Most of your people that could write things down, like history or whatever, literature, are all mostly in the Catholic Church. They're monks, they're priests, whatever. Like St. Gregory of Tours, who's like one of the first that wrote about the Franks as an example, right there. Or Einhard, a Christian monk that wrote about Charlemagne. The Venerable Bede, who wrote about the Anglo-Saxon culture, like in England. So most of them are in the church, as an example. There's still a lot of Roman things around, like the idea of law, architecture, language, Roman technologies. The idea of cement was kind of rediscovered and things like that, in the future. So all those things were things that kind of, mixed together to create this new Europe, if you want to call it that, more than anything. Let me first talk about, of course, the Franks that come in. The Franks are really important that come in as a people. Here, of course, is a picture of one of their first kings that's well known, which is Clovis the First, King Clovis. And what happened back in Western Europe, the Franks formed. The Franks were related to these people that came out of northern Germany, the Saline Franks, they're called, and they were kind of like in the area around the Rhine River, and they lived kind of partially in the Roman Empire early on. And what happened was they came into Gaul, which is France, and took it over. They formed their own state over time, which later was nicknamed the Kingdom of the Franks, or the other name they call it later is Francia, which means France now, or I guess the land of the Franks. And anyway, it was King Clovis was one of their first kings who came in, who ruled their state starting in the late 5th century. And he actually was a descendant of this some kind of early Frankish ruler named Merovich, where they got their name from. And Merovich was supposed to be this early king that supported like the Romans when Attila the Hun attacked, France in the mid 5th century. And so he formed this dynasty around the 480s. And the reason why Clovis is very important is because he was one of the first medieval rulers to convert to Roman Catholicism, which they think he did sometime around 496. And he then began converting his whole kingdom to the Catholic faith. And before that, most of the Germans in the West were either pagans or they worshiped the Arian Christian form of Christianity that was kind of considered heretical. So anyway, so that's who Clovis is, more or less. And Clovis, by the way, is kind of important later. He's kind of seen as the future history of France. He's like the first king of France, if you want to call him that. The future history of France, anyway. And his name, actually, the name Clovis, is Latin for Louis or Louis. We'll say it that way, basically. So they have all these kings named Louis, right? Had up to Louis the, I think, 18th. They had a bunch of them, Louis. They had, as you know. And like Louis the 14th, probably the most famous, which Louisiana is named after. So yeah, that's where the name originated from. But like if you take the C off and you put the V as a U, you get, Louis or Louis, of course, from that. Now, the only thing about the Merovingian kings is that over time they became figureheads. They really weren't the real power behind the throne. And what happened was by the 7th, 8th centuries, they had these powerful ministers that basically controlled their kingdom and also their palace, which was called a mayor of the palace, which I think in Latin it was major domo. That's how they say it. The word domo is a word meaning palace or a house, basically. And the word major is where you get the word mayor from, like a mayor of a city, as you know. I guess it's kind of how it started out. And then over time, he became like the head of the household. He was head of the military. And he became kind of like a prime minister. I think that's what people compare it to now, like a prime minister who's really the head of the government. And you got a king who's like a figurehead or queen, like in Britain. And so that's kind of what it was. The first, if you know about a lot of these Merovingian rulers, a lot of them came out of northern Germany, an area called Austrasia, which is kind of like an area that would be northern Germany, Belgium, and like also where the Netherlands is, like the Dutch Republic is, and all that later. And they controlled like a lot of the actual rule behind the throne of the Merovingians for like the 7th and the 8th centuries. Here's kind of a map showing you the area that they controlled. I'll kind of add it right here. They have Austrasia right here. You can see over time that the actual area of the Franks that they controlled would expand. So it's mostly the state started here, this area right here. Aachen later will be one of their main cities they'll have. You see Aachen, Cologne, Metz. You may have heard of these cities that originally formed there. Then they pushed down into northern France where Paris is. Then you can see down in the Aquitaine, they controlled that area. So you can see the kingdom of the Franks would expand over time. Eventually, you'll see by the time of Charlemagne, it'll get into an area that's like France, part of Spain, Germany, and Italy. So it gets pretty large in size. Then you've got this other famous ruler, of course, who was a good example of one of the actual, mayors of the palace we're talking about, Major Domo, which is Charles Martel. He's really the most famous one they had. Martel was mostly known as a statesman and military leader, like a general, pretty much. And his Latin name, by the way, is actually Carolus Magnus, which means in Latin Charles the Hammer, is what it means. Martellus is just, actually it should be Carolus. I got that wrong. It should be Carolus Martellus. Got that spelled wrong, just realized. Carolus Martellus was his actual name. And the reason why he was called the Hammer was because of the fact that he was known for, he may have brandished a hammer in battle, but he was known for hammering his enemies. It should be Carolus Martellus there, if that's correct. And one of the things that Martel was very famous for, he defeated a Muslim invasion by the Umayyad Caliphate, which occurred in the early 8th century, when mostly the Moors, which were like a mixture of like Arabic Berber peoples from like basically from Morocco, where North Africa, they invaded they took over Spain. You know about this, where Iberia is, Iberian Peninsula, crushed the what was the Visigothic kingdom, and then from there they were going to invade France and take it over. And anyway, Martel's forces at the Battle of Tours in October of that year, near the city of Poitiers, I think also they called it, crushed them, basically almost wiped their force out, causing high casualties, like 10-1, I think, in casualties. And anyway, Tours was kind of seen as this battle which would shape Frankish power, not just in Western Europe, but Catholic as well, because a lot of people think it kind of saved Catholicism or helped spread Catholicism afterwards, because Islam was pushed back into Spain at that point. And so they were never able to really take over parts of Western Europe like they wanted to, more or less. So Martel was kind of considered a major figure that helped, increase the power of the Frankish kingdom and also the amount of territory that they controlled as well. Also, another thing about Charles Martel, he had a son named Pepin or Pippin III, or known as the Short. Pepin the Short, they called him, who ruled afterwards as a major domo. He actually would overthrow the actual Merovingian dynasty, take it over. And he would actually start his own dynasty of king called Carolingian that follows afterwards. So-called Carolingian dynasty named after Charles Martel. That one became more famous because that one became more like an empire that would follow later, more or less. I don't really have a picture of Pepin the Short or Pepin III, but most of these Frankish kings or rulers all had nicknames that they kind of went by. Of course, the most famous they talk about, ruler-wise, that would come to power after Pepin the Short died was his son, which of course was Charlemagne. Charlemagne came in, of course, next, and who ruled. And the Charlemagne reigned as one of the greatest of the Frankish rulers. He reigned from the 8th to the early 9th centuries. By the way, 46 years that he reigned, which almost half a century that he's in power. He's considered one of the greatest rulers in the early Middle Ages that comes to power. His real name is Carolus Magnus. That should be the real name for him, which is Charles the Great. But later on, if you know about the French kind of slur the name, and if you look at the name, it's actually Charlemagne is actually Charlemagne, Charles the Great, basically right there. Which the word Carolus is also the word like where you get the word Carl from. If you know about that, Carl or Carol, originates from that name. And his state will become an empire under Charlemagne. It'll kind of spawn, be called that later. Of course, it's called all kinds of names. I don't know if it really had an official name that it was actually called one point, because they called it Francia from a long time ago. And but his empire would expand over time, because if you go look at a map here of his empire, which is right here, early on his empire controlled most of like France from there, and then you can see he'll eventually take over like northern Germany, where Saxony is today, southern Germany, where Bavaria is. He also controlled northern Italy. And they think Charlemagne also later conquered part of the northern part of Spain, like above the Pyrenees, where Barcelona is today. So that's one thing about Charlemagne, which is kind of important about his reign. He's going to kind of unify Western Europe. He was one of the first rulers to actually do that since the Roman times. There was a writer, by the way, during his time that knew Charlemagne pretty good. His name was Einhard. Einhard was this Christian monk, like priest, that became his biographer. He wrote a series of books about Charlemagne that became a biography called The Life of Charlemagne. It was called, or Vita Corelli Magni, which actually means the life of Charles. It's actually the original name. It was called, now they call it Charlemagne, I guess now. It was written sometime in the close to the mid-9th century, like right after Charlemagne died. And so that's why we know so much about Charlemagne and his reign. I think without him, we wouldn't really know as much about him. He was a big man. They supposedly say Charlemagne was like 6'4". Like a lot of your Germans tend to be like bigger people. You know about that. He was a huge man. So Charlemagne. And anyway, like I said, he was known for his conquest. He expanded the empire, like doubled in size, and as he expanded his empire, he also converted everybody to Catholicism. That's something he's known for. He was often called Iron Charles by a lot of the Catholics because of the fact that he was seen as this great Catholic that spread the faith, to everybody and stuff like for them. But for today, Charlemagne is often seen as the father of Europe because of the fact that he unified a lot of Western Europe, not just make it like Christian or Catholic or whatever, but also unified it into like a lot of the states that he would be into, of course, later. Charlemagne was also a guy that helped to have a renaissance in like art and culture. He was a patron of the arts, culture. They have a Carolingian Renaissance they have, which kind of brings back some of these ideas that have been lost, in the Middle Ages. Hey, Alina, what's going on this morning? Also as well. Let me also talk about the fact that eventually what happened was at first he was a king, like the king of the Franks originally, but they think that what happened with Charlemagne, he was eventually crowned as, they either call it king of the Romans or some people call him emperor of the Romans. There's different nicknames that they actually call his title, but they believe the Catholic Church was behind it. The Catholic Church kind of saw the Franks as their saviors, to protect the Christian faith, in Western Europe. And so they realized that Charlemagne was becoming this powerful ruler that had united the West. And so the Pope of the Catholic Church in Rome, Leo III, basically crowned him as ruler of the Romans, king of the Romans or emperor of the Romans on Christmas Day 800. And so a lot of people kind of view that as being the beginning of this Western Roman Empire, if you want to call it, that's being refounded in the West. But it's more of a Germanic version of it, is kind of what's being created with Charlemagne. Of course, a lot of people view it as the founding of what they call later the Holy Roman Empire, which is mostly made up of Germany later. But a lot of people kind of view Charlemagne as the founder of the Holy Roman Empire, and he's like the first Holy Roman Emperor. And some claim that's his actual title he went by, but just kind of not sure exactly what the title was. I think it was more King of the Romans is what it actually was, more than anything. But he is called by different titles, more or less. If you go back to that map here too, by the way, it shows like his capital, which the capital of the his empire, the Carolingian Empire, was at Aachen, which Aachen's now in Western Germany, close to where Belgium is. And it's famous for a cathedral he built there. It's well known today. A lot of people still go and visit it, which is called Aachen Cathedral. It's also where he'll be later buried. He's buried actually inside that cathedral. I think it was later damaged in World War II. I know, like, some of the windows were damaged in the war when the Allies bombed Nazi Germany and all that. But it's been kind of restored now. That's kind of the way it looks now after the restoration of it, modern times. But Aachen was his capital. Some people think Paris or something like was the capital, but it's actually Aachen was where he ruled from, basically. Now, after he died, which was about 814, they believe, he had a son too, as well, who I've got a picture of, I'll add, which is Louis the Pious. He was called, you see on the right, who ruled, by the way, 814 to 840. So I guess he was the second emperor of the Carolingian empire that founded afterwards, right here. And he was a pretty good ruler. He was called pious because the fact that he was very religious, also like very Catholic. He and his father built a lot of churches and cathedrals, all over the empire. And anyway, the only thing was his empire was racked with civil war. It got to the point where his sons eventually, which were the grandsons of Charlemagne, eventually began fighting for control of the empire. And I think that supposedly at the end of his reign, he kind of went senile or insane. I think of exactly what it was. And they put him in a monastery or something, got rid of him. And his sons just fought over. They actually had 4 sons that fought over, but only 3 survived the actual civil war. And what happened was, in the end, they divided the empire, the Carolingian Empire, into 3 parts, which were, they called it Western Francia, Middle Francia, and Eastern Francia. You can see on the map they're on there, like the western part, which you see right here. It's actually Western Francia. That's what they called it, which is the West Frankish kingdom. Charles the Bald got that part. Most of that became France later. The Kingdom of France will kind of evolve from this area with Paris there as its capital right here. The Central Kingdom, which is like Middle Francia too, they called it. That'll basically be like the that's like part of northern Germany, where like the Netherlands is. I guess where part of Belgium is, Switzerland, and in northern Italy right here. And then Eastern Francia, that East Frankish kingdom, will be Louis the German will take that over. They think this part is the bulk of the area, which will include like the Holy Roman Empire, kind of emerge out of that later as well. So you get like, France over here, Holy Roman Empire mostly over here, that kind of break apart. So, yeah, that's the only thing about it. The only thing that's bad, about the Treaty of Verdun was it fragmented, their empire. If the empire would have stayed together, that might have changed history. Like medieval Europe may have been totally different, if that. But later, what you're going to happen is, you've got other invasions coming in too, like the Viking period, Viking Age comes in too. Which also helps to cause also a decline in the West as well. So I'll talk about that later, in my part 2 lecture coming up on the Middle Age. We'll get into the Vikings, how they come out of Scandinavia. I'll talk about also the Crusades. The Crusades was also another major event that was real big, of course, in the High Middle Ages that comes in later after the early Middle Ages. So I'll get into that topic as well. And then later in the week on Thursday, I'll get into the later Middle Ages as well and talk about some of the major events that are also included there as well.